Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the Historical Society. We are now in June 2025, which means it's the 250th anniversary of the first meetings of South Carolina's Council of Safety, which served kind of as an executive branch of government during the early days of the American Revolution here in our state. The Council of Safety was a group of men appointed by the Provincial Congress of South Carolina in the wake of the battles of Lexington and Concord, way up in Massachusetts. Now, colonists everywhere were feeling a sense of urgency at that point, and life then began to change pretty rapidly here in America. Here at the Historical Society, we hold a journal from the first few meetings of the Council of Safety in our Henry Lawrence papers, who was president of that council. The main job of the council was to form the militia regiments and give orders as to where they went. They also created currency for our state, right down to the design of the paper money, oversaw the secret committee, who acted on secret missions, communicated about the conflict with indigenous tribes, and even handled citizen reports of those who may have been loyalists. But before we get too far into the formation of the wartime government and how it affected those with power and those without, let's hear some announcements. Join us this summer for Mornings at the Fireproof, a relaxed monthly coffee meetup on the patio of the historic Fireproof building. Enjoy your morning brew and meaningful conversation with our CEO, Dr. Elizabeth Chu. From local history to community happenings, it's a welcoming space to sip, share, and connect with the Historical Society. Mornings at the Fireproof will take place on Thursdays, June 12th, July 10th, and August 14th, from 8 to 9 a.m., and they're free and open to the public. A heads up for our researchers that our archives will be closed for 2 weeks this summer, June 16th through the 27th, so that we can have some work done on upgrading our climate control system. And summer is the perfect time to learn about our historic Fireproof building, especially because it's air conditioned. Our education coordinator, Melina Teston, hosts an architectural tour of the building every Friday at 2 p.m. Tickets for the tours are $5 a person, and you can purchase them in person or reserve a spot. Find out how to do that and get more information about all of our events at the Programs and Events tab on our website, schistory.org. Our sources start, obviously, with the Council of Safety Journal, housed within the Henry Lawrence papers in our archives. In addition to that, we used several articles with transcriptions of the journals published in the South Carolina Historical Magazine, other items from the Henry Lawrence papers, the African American Revolutionary Soldiers Honor Project accessed through the South Carolina 250th Commission's website, Memoirs of the American Revolution by William Moultrie, a blog post, This Month in History, the German Friendly Society was established by Mandy McGee Floyd on the South Carolina Historical Society's website, and the South Carolina Encyclopedia. So instead of reading directly from the first Council of Safety Journal, I want to talk about an overview of what they did in terms of how it affected all of the people of South Carolina. The journal that we hold covers about 5 weeks or so of those first meetings, and I want to start by naming the members of that council. So there were 13 of them in all, and the council did get changed out as the months went on. But in that first iteration, the president, as I mentioned, was Henry Lawrence, and Peter Timothy, a printer in Charleston, was the secretary. Other members also included Charles Pinckney, Rollins Lowndes, Miles Bruton, Arthur Middleton, Thomas Hayward Jr., and William Henry Drayton, among others. These men were already leaders in the community. Most of them were wealthy planters and large landholders, but their actions and decisions affected everyone in the state, including those who were enslaved, Native Americans who lived under their own ruling systems, men who were not of means, and women who had no say in how their government was run. On June 17, 1775, the Council of Safety, which was officially formed the day before, begins signing commissions for officers in the Army. They end up creating 2 regiments of foot, today we would call those infantry, and 1 regiment of Rangers, today we would refer to that as cavalry. At this point in the war, the men who enlisted had to serve for at least 6 months, but not longer than 3 years, and they were being provided with some provisions, including some guns and their accessories to go along with them, kettles, blankets, and some food. I want to talk about one particular man who enlisted during this time, and his name was Andrew Smith. He signed up to serve in the 1st Regiment of Foot, commanded by Christopher Gadsden. Smith was in a company led by Captain Adam McDonald. We don't know where Smith was from originally, but we do know that he served throughout the war. By 1780, he was a hospital mate and still in the 1st Regiment, according to records. That same year, he was taken prisoner during the siege of Charleston, and while imprisoned on Hadrell's Point in today's Mount Pleasant, he was a servant to his captain at the time, Captain William Hext, who was also imprisoned. By 1783, when the war ended, he was still listed as a private, but he was now serving in the Continental Army in the 3rd Company of the South Carolina Continental Troops. In 1795, so just after the war, he was granted 100 acres of registered Army land, which, according to the warrant certificate, was meant to be, quote, in any of the districts appropriated for satisfying the bounties of land due to the late Army of the United States, end quote. So here was a man who was probably not wealthy or well-educated, considering he spent his whole career as a private, and his whole life changed with the war. He was captured during battle and was imprisoned during the war. We can imagine that he learned some medical skills since he was listed as a hospital mate at one point. He survived the horrors of war for years and came out the other side with some land and possibly a pension. The council also led some of the charge on where troops were to go. They were the group that ordered the 4th Regiment to take Fort Johnson from the British in the fall of 1775, which we've discussed in our first podcast about that regiment's order book. On June 26, 1775, the council also ordered William Thompson to take his troop of Rangers and go to Fort Charlotte in today's McCormick County to take charge of all gunpowder and military supplies there. One of those men leading a group to the fort was Moses Kirkland, who, after seizing the fort's supplies for the Patriots, switched sides and started fighting with the Loyalists. In another decision made on June 26th, the council approved designs and denominations for South Carolina's own currency. They detailed out the graphics and mottos for the 5, 10, 20, and 50-pound notes in their meeting minutes. Now, I have to say, my favorite description is of the 50-pound note, which features a woman in tears. It's unknown whether she represents Great Britain or America, and the motto, Post Tenebris Lux, which means after darkness, light. In fact, we hold 2 of these notes in our collection at the archives, and we're posting them as part of our Council of Safety social media series, so look out for those on June 26th. Loyalists weren't just a problem in the Fort Charlotte area. The entire backcountry was a hotbed of Loyalist activity, so much so that many historians refer to the American Revolution as a civil war here in South Carolina. The members of the Council of Safety were responsible for investigating and dealing with those who may be acting against the interests of South Carolina. So they brought in suspected Loyalists for questioning, like John and Elizabeth Simpson, who claimed to have met with the royal governor, Lord William Campbell, about how to get more people in the backcountry to fight for the crown. And you may remember we talked a little bit about Elizabeth Simpson in our last episode. But the council also wrote letters questioning accused loyalists like Thomas Fletchall, who was leading a group against the colonists, and John Stuart, who fled to St. Augustine on accusations by the council of conspiring with Native Americans to fight for Great Britain. And the council also interviewed people like John Burnet. Burnet was a Scottish-born preacher living in today's Colleton County and was accused of meeting with enslaved people alone against the wishes of their enslavers under the guise of religion. On July 5th, 1775, a man named Thomas Hutchinson wrote to the council to report these acts, accusing Burnet of trying to encourage the enslaved people to rise and revolt against those who owned them. In his letter to the council, Hutchinson said that several enslaved people were arrested for trying to incite a revolt, and one ultimately was sentenced to death. Just before his execution, that enslaved man named John Burnet, who, according to Hutchinson, was already an outcast, of holding, quote, nocturnal meetings of the slaves under the sanction of religion, and then repeatedly inculcated such doctrines as were principally instrumental in bringing the poor unhappy object to the gallows, and others punished to a lesser degree. Hutchinson went on to write that several other enslaved people had reported that Burnet claimed King George III was, quote, about to alter the world and set the Negroes free, end quote, and that those enslaved were, quote, equally entitled to the good things of this life in common with the whites, end quote. Burnet was brought before the council to be interviewed and volunteered to leave South Carolina, so he was never punished. But in fact, Henry Lawrence, president of the council, believed Burnet and said the preacher claimed that he had, quote, never a thought of exciting them to insurrection, end quote. Lawrence actually later employed Burnet on one of his plantations, working with the people that Lawrence himself enslaved there. The Council of Safety also performed in diplomatic roles to ensure that groups around the state were informed of the conflict between America and Great Britain and that they were inclined to fight with the Americans. On July 3rd, 1775, the council resolved to send emissaries into the backcountry of South Carolina, which would have included today's Columbia and surrounding Midlands, to speak with the German people who lived there about the conflict. The Germans in Charleston had grown more accustomed to the ways of their new home, and many of them spoke English. But the German people in the area of Dutch Fork were more insular and often spoke only the language of their mother country. So a Mr. Long and Mr. Wagner were sent to that area to talk to the Germans about, quote, the present situation of American affairs, end quote. Now, many of those Germans in the backcountry ended up siding with the Loyalists, while the Germans here in Charleston were often patriots, and they actually formed the first German military company in the United States called the German Fusiliers. Like the Germans, other communities who weren't in leadership roles in the new state government needed to be coerced to join forces with the Americans. So on July 5th, 1775, the Council of Safety sent a letter via messengers to the Catawba Nation and to the Cherokees, explaining the breakdown in the relationship between Great Britain and America and asking both to stay on their side. However, the request isn't without threat. They wrote, quote, for we have a long time held you by the hand of friendship, and if you mind what we say, we will continue to hold you fast. But if you do not mind what we say, you will be sorry for it by and by, end quote. Now, some of the Native American groups would switch their loyalties throughout the war, as did some white colonists, by the way, depending on who was in power and what was being offered. Another job of the council was to appoint others to help with this role. In October of 1775, George Galphin was appointed Commissioner for Indian Affairs of the Southern Department. His role was to act as an ambassador between the South Carolina government and the Native American groups, and some, like Henry Lawrence, credit him with preventing the southern states being defeated by an alliance between the British and the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations, because Galphin was there to make sure that that alliance didn't happen. This iteration of the Council of Safety went on for several more months before a new group was elected by the Provincial Congress in November of 1775, though many of the same original members remained. They were in power until a permanent state government was established in March of 1776. The South Carolina Historical Society only holds that first journal, which, as I said, covers about 5 weeks or so of the council. But there are other documents in the Henry Lawrence papers that discuss and involve some of their activity. Because Henry Lawrence did remain president throughout both iterations of the council until they were replaced in March of 1776. It's sort of astounding to think about how much they accomplished in that 1 month. The lives of some white men were upended when they were recruited into military service, along with the lives of the women they left at home or who traveled with them. Enslavers had a new reason to be suspicious of enslaved people's activities because maybe they were siding with the Loyalists or the British, and maybe for the first time in America, enslaved people had a glimmer of hope that a change in leader might provide a different life for them. Native Americans had to decide who would be best to partner with, as did people in the backcountry where Loyalists were plentiful. A lot about people's lives was being upended and changed on a daily basis, even down to the paper money that they used. We, of course, know how everything turned out, but at the time, I'm sure it was disorienting and concerning and also maybe a little exciting, especially for those on the council who really believed in the cause. So we'll end it there, but we'll be back on the second Monday of next month with another episode about the 4th Regiment's order book. And it may be the last one because we're getting close to the end of the journal. We'll see you then.